The most dangerous person in a free society isn't the obvious authoritarian, it's the brilliant intellectual who surrenders critical thinking for ideological certainty. I witnessed this transformation throughout the 20th century, watching some of the finest minds of my generation abandon empirical analysis for what I called the opium of the intellectuals. Today, as American democracy faces its own intellectual crisis, the patterns I observed among French intellectuals offer crucial lessons about how ideology corrupts reasoning and why intellectual independence remains democracy's most precious safeguard. The trap isn't obvious, it's seductive, promising clarity in an uncertain world while demanding the surrender of the very faculties that make genuine understanding possible. What begins as legitimate concern for justice ends as dogmatic thinking that destroys the very foundations of democratic discourse. Chapter 1: The Seduction of Certainty. When intellectuals abandon the uncomfortable discipline of empirical observation for the comforting embrace of ideological systems, they don't realize they're trading their greatest asset, critical thinking, for fool's gold. Throughout the Cold War, I watched brilliant colleagues transform from rigorous analysts into ideological advocates, convinced they had discovered the key to understanding all of history and politics through a single theoretical lens. The pattern was always the same. It began with a genuine concern about social injustice or political problems, legitimate concerns that demanded serious analysis. But instead of maintaining the intellectual humility necessary for understanding complex phenomena, these thinkers embraced totalizing explanations that promised to resolve all contradictions and uncertainties. Marxism offered the most seductive version of this intellectual trap, providing a complete explanation for historical development, class struggle, and human liberation that seemed to make all other forms of analysis superfluous. What made this transformation so devastating was that it occurred among people with exceptional analytical capabilities. These weren't simple propagandists or political activists, they were sophisticated thinkers who had demonstrated their capacity for nuanced reasoning in other domains. Yet ideology proved more powerful than intelligence, offering psychological comfort that rigorous analysis couldn't provide. The uncertainty inherent in honest intellectual work became unbearable when measured against the false certainty that ideological commitment offered. The appeal was understandable. Facing the complexities of modern industrial society, the horrors of 2 world wars, and the apparent failures of democratic institutions to prevent economic depression and social inequality, many intellectuals desperately wanted a framework that could explain everything and point toward redemption. Ideology provided that framework, promising not just understanding but moral certainty and historical vindication for those wise enough to embrace its teachings. But the price was intellectual integrity. Once committed to an ideological system, these thinkers began filtering all evidence through predetermined conclusions, defending their worldview against contradictory facts rather than adjusting their theories to accommodate new evidence. They became, in essence, intellectual prisoners of their own certainties, losing the very quality that had made them valuable contributors to public discourse in the first place. This transformation represented more than personal failure, it constituted a betrayal of the intellectual's fundamental responsibility to society. In democratic systems, intellectuals serve as society's early warning system, using their analytical capabilities to identify problems and propose solutions based on careful observation of reality. When they abandon this role for ideological advocacy, they leave society intellectually defenseless against the very problems they were supposed to help solve. Chapter 2: The Mechanics of Intellectual Surrender. The process by which intelligent people abandon critical thinking for ideological conformity follows predictable patterns that every democracy must understand if it hopes to preserve its intellectual health. It begins subtly, with the gradual elevation of theoretical elegance over empirical accuracy. Intellectuals become so enamored with the logical consistency of their chosen system that they lose interest in testing its predictions against observable reality, preferring the beautiful symmetry of theory to the messy complexity of actual human experience. I observed this transformation most clearly among my contemporaries who embraced Marxist analysis during the height of its influence in French intellectual circles. Initially, they were drawn to Marx's sophisticated critique of capitalist economics and his insights into class relations, legitimate intellectual contributions worthy of serious consideration by anyone interested in understanding modern society. The analytical power of concepts like alienation, exploitation, and class consciousness provided genuine illumination of social phenomena that other theoretical frameworks had failed to explain adequately. But gradually, Marx's analytical framework became not a tool for understanding but a lens that filtered out inconvenient truths. When Soviet realities contradicted Marxist predictions about the withering away of the state and the liberation of the working class, these intellectuals didn't question their theoretical commitments, they questioned the reliability of reports from the Soviet Union. When socialist experiments in Eastern Europe produced authoritarianism rather than liberation, bureaucratic oppression rather than worker control, they explained away the evidence as temporary aberrations, Western propaganda, or betrayals of authentic socialist principles. The theory became more real than reality itself, creating a parallel universe where logical deduction from first principles carried more weight than empirical observation of actual outcomes. This intellectual methodology represents a fundamental betrayal of the scholarly enterprise, which depends on the constant interaction between theoretical hypothesis and observational testing. Genuine analysis requires maintaining the discipline of constantly testing our hypotheses against new evidence, remaining willing to revise our conclusions when facts demand it. But ideological commitment reverses this process, making reality subordinate to theory. Instead of using theory to illuminate reality, ideological thinkers use selective interpretation of reality to confirm their theoretical commitments. They develop elaborate methodologies for explaining away contradictory evidence while treating any fact that supports their worldview as decisive proof of its validity. This creates an intellectual system that is effectively immune to refutation, the very characteristic that Karl Popper identified as the hallmark of pseudoscientific thinking. The tragedy is that this surrender often occurs among people with genuine moral commitments who want to understand injustice and contribute to human progress, admirable goals that democratic society desperately needs from its intellectual class. But their impatience with uncertainty and their desire for moral clarity lead them to embrace systems that promise more than any honest analysis can deliver, trading intellectual integrity for psychological comfort. Chapter 3: The French Intellectual Example and its American Parallels. Consider how you approach political questions in your own intellectual life. Do you start with evidence and follow it toward provisional conclusions, or do you begin with moral certainties and arrange evidence to support them? This distinction reveals whether you're thinking analytically or ideologically, and it determines whether your contributions strengthen or weaken democratic discourse. The choice may seem abstract, but it has profound consequences for the quality of public debate and the health of democratic institutions. The French intellectual scene of my era provides a cautionary tale that American democracy ignores at its peril. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the most brilliant philosophical minds of the 20th century, exemplified how ideological commitment can corrupt even exceptional intelligence. Despite overwhelming evidence of Soviet oppression, the show trials, the gulags, the suppression of dissent, the betrayal of socialist ideals, Sartre continued defending communist regimes because abandoning his ideological framework would have required admitting fundamental errors in his worldview and political commitments. Sartre's case wasn't unique. It represented a broader pattern among French intellectuals who elevated theoretical consistency over empirical accuracy. They created elaborate intellectual constructions that explained away contradictory evidence rather than adjusting their theories to accommodate inconvenient facts. Their commitment to revolution in theory blinded them to the realities of revolution in practice, leading them to defend regimes that embodied everything they claimed to oppose, authoritarianism, inequality, and the suppression of human freedom. The psychological mechanisms behind this intellectual failure remain active today. American intellectuals face similar temptations, though the ideological content differs from the Marxist orthodoxies that dominated French intellectual life during the Cold War. Whether embracing progressive orthodoxies that promise social transformation through radical restructuring of American institutions, or conservative doctrines that promise restoration of traditional values through return to past arrangements, the underlying pattern remains the same: the surrender of critical analysis for ideological certainty. The academic world particularly encourages this transformation by rewarding theoretical sophistication over empirical accuracy. Scholars gain recognition for developing elegant theoretical frameworks that explain complex phenomena through simple principles, not for the messy work of testing those frameworks against the stubborn complexity of real-world situations. Graduate students learn to construct arguments that defend their theoretical commitments rather than methods for honestly evaluating competing explanations, creating intellectual habits that persist throughout their careers. This dynamic creates intellectual echo chambers where challenging fundamental assumptions becomes professionally dangerous and personally costly. Dissent is interpreted as betrayal, nuance as weakness, and empirical objections as evidence of moral or intellectual failure. The result is the same intellectual sterility that characterized French intellectual life during the Cold War: sophisticated minds producing elaborate justifications for predetermined conclusions rather than genuine analysis of complex realities. Chapter 4: The Institutional Reinforcement of Ideological Thinking. The most insidious aspect of ideological capture is how institutions designed to promote critical thinking instead become mechanisms for enforcing intellectual conformity. Universities, media organizations, and think tanks that should serve as bulwarks against dogmatic thinking often become its primary propagators, creating professional incentives that reward ideological loyalty over analytical rigor. This institutional corruption represents perhaps the greatest threat to democratic discourse, because it transforms the very organization society depends on for honest analysis into engines of sophisticated propaganda. In French universities during my era, Marxist analysis became not just one approach among many but the dominant framework for understanding social reality across multiple disciplines. Students learned to apply Marxist concepts mechanically to every phenomenon, from literature to economics to international relations, without questioning whether these concepts actually illuminated the phenomena under investigation. This wasn't education, it was indoctrination dressed in intellectual respectability, producing graduates who could recite theoretical formulas but couldn't think independently about complex problems. The same dynamic operates in contemporary American institutions, though with different ideological content and more subtle enforcement mechanisms. Academic departments, journalistic organizations, and policy institutes develop unwritten rules about acceptable conclusions that researchers and writers must reach. Deviation from these orthodoxies doesn't result in explicit censorship but in professional isolation and career damage, the modern equivalent of academic excommunication. Consider how this affects the quality of analysis these institutions produce. When researchers know in advance what conclusions they must reach, they stop asking genuine questions and start constructing elaborate justifications for predetermined answers. The scholarly apparatus becomes a machine for generating sophisticated rationalizations rather than reliable knowledge. Research methodologies become tools for confirming biases rather than testing hypotheses, and peer review becomes a mechanism for enforcing conformity rather than ensuring quality. The problem extends beyond academia into media and policy circles, where similar dynamics operate with even more direct political consequences. Journalists learn which narratives they can pursue and which they must avoid, not through explicit editorial directives but through the accumulated wisdom of what advances careers and what destroys them. Policy analysts understand which recommendations will enhance their influence and which will marginalize them, leading to a systematic bias toward politically acceptable conclusions regardless of their empirical foundation. Think tanks, despite their claims to objective analysis, often function as advocacy organizations disguised as research institutions, producing studies designed to support their funders' political objectives rather than illuminate complex realities. The appearance of scholarly rigor, extensive footnotes, statistical analysis, peer review, masks the fundamentally ideological nature of much contemporary policy research. This institutional corruption of intellectual life represents a profound threat to democratic governance, which depends on citizens having access to honest analysis of public problems rather than elaborate propaganda campaigns disguised as scholarship. When institutions abandon their commitment to truth-seeking in favor of ideological advocacy, they undermine the information foundation that democratic decision-making requires, leaving citizens intellectually defenseless against demagogues and special interests. Chapter 5: The Personal Cost of Intellectual Independence. Ask yourself honestly, would you be willing to sacrifice professional advancement and social acceptance to maintain intellectual honesty? The choice between ideological conformity and analytical independence isn't abstract. It has real consequences for careers, relationships, and personal identity that every thinking person must navigate. Understanding these costs is essential, because intellectual integrity cannot survive if we remain naive about the price it demands or the psychological pressures that undermine it. Throughout my career, I paid a significant price for refusing to embrace the ideological orthodoxies that dominated French intellectual life. While my contemporaries gained celebrity and influence by aligning with fashionable causes, particularly the communist sympathies that swept through Parisian intellectual circles during the Cold War, I remained committed to empirical analysis that often reached unpopular conclusions about Soviet realities and Marxist predictions. This commitment brought professional isolation, personal attacks, and exclusion from intellectual circles that valued political loyalty over analytical rigor. The loneliness of intellectual independence cannot be overstated, particularly in academic environments where professional success depends heavily on peer acceptance and institutional approval. Humans are social creatures who naturally seek acceptance and belonging, especially within the communities that share their interests and values. When you refuse to endorse the beliefs that define your intellectual community, you risk becoming an outsider in the very circles where you most want to belong. The temptation to conform isn't just professional, it's deeply personal, touching on fundamental needs for connection and validation. But the alternative is worse than loneliness. Once you surrender intellectual integrity for social acceptance, you lose something essential about yourself as a thinking person. You become a performer rather than a thinker, crafting arguments to please audiences rather than illuminate truth. Your mind becomes a tool for advancing other people's agendas rather than an instrument for understanding reality. The very capacity for independent thought that made you valuable as an intellectual atrophies through disuse. American intellectuals today face similar pressures and similar choices, though often in more subtle forms than the explicit political litmus tests that characterized my era. Academic careers depend increasingly on ideological conformity rather than scholarly excellence, with hiring, promotion, and tenure decisions influenced by candidates' political positions as much as their intellectual achievements. Media opportunities flow disproportionately to those who reinforce prevailing narratives rather than challenge them with inconvenient facts or alternative interpretations. Social media creates particularly powerful incentives for intellectual posturing rather than genuine analysis, rewarding provocative statements that generate engagement over careful reasoning that promotes understanding. The pressure to maintain an active online presence forces intellectuals to take public positions on complex issues before they've had time for adequate analysis, creating momentum toward increasingly extreme positions that are difficult to revise without losing credibility. Yet some individuals still choose the harder path of intellectual independence, maintaining their commitment to empirical analysis despite professional and social costs. These people represent democracy's intellectual immune system, the critical thinkers who resist ideological capture and insist on evaluating ideas based on evidence rather than political utility. Their example demonstrates that intellectual courage remains possible even in environments designed to discourage it. Chapter 6: International Patterns of Intellectual Conformity. The corruption of intellectual life by ideological thinking isn't uniquely American or French. It represents a recurring pattern in democratic societies facing political stress, economic uncertainty, and social transformation. By examining how intellectuals in different countries have responded to similar pressures throughout modern history, we can better understand the universal dynamics that threaten analytical independence and identify the institutional safeguards that help preserve intellectual diversity and critical thinking. British intellectuals during the 1930s faced comparable pressures as economic depression and rising fascism created demand for totalizing explanations and radical solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Many embraced communist sympathies, convinced that Soviet communism represented humanity's best hope for overcoming capitalism's apparent failures and fascism's growing threat. The Cambridge 5 spy ring exemplified this intellectual attraction to communist ideology, demonstrating how ideological commitment could override national loyalty among highly educated individuals who should have understood the stakes involved. Writers like George Orwell initially shared these sympathies before empirical observation of communist realities forced them to reconsider their commitments. Orwell's intellectual journey illustrates both the power of ideological attraction and the possibility of recovery through honest observation. His experiences in Spain during the Civil War revealed the gap between communist theory and practice, forcing him to choose between ideological loyalty and intellectual honesty. His decision to prioritize truth over political convenience produced some of the 20th century's most important warnings about totalitarian thinking. German intellectuals faced even more extreme pressures as Nazism promised national renewal through racial ideology and authoritarian leadership. Many academics who should have provided critical analysis instead lent their credentials to pseudoscientific theories that justified persecution and war. Their surrender demonstrates how even sophisticated educational systems can become vehicles for propaganda when intellectual institutions abandon their commitment to empirical truth in favor of political expediency. The pattern repeated itself in various forms throughout the communist world, where intellectuals faced direct pressure to conform to state ideologies while maintaining the pretense of independent scholarship. The tragic cases of intellectuals who initially supported communist revolutions only to become victims of the very systems they had helped legitimize illustrate the ultimate futility of sacrificing intellectual integrity for political convenience. Contemporary examples from around the world show similar patterns operating in different contexts. In authoritarian societies, intellectuals face direct pressure to conform to state ideologies through censorship, imprisonment, and economic sanctions. But even in democratic societies, subtle pressures encourage intellectual conformity through professional incentives, social expectations, and cultural norms that reward ideological loyalty over analytical independence. The most resilient intellectual cultures maintain institutional diversity that prevents any single orthodoxy from dominating scholarly discourse. When universities, media organizations, and think tanks represent diverse perspectives and maintain genuine commitment to empirical analysis, they create space for the kind of critical thinking that democracy requires. Competition between different intellectual institutions helps preserve intellectual freedom by ensuring that dissenting voices can find institutional support even when they challenge prevailing orthodoxies. Chapter 7: Recovering Intellectual Freedom. Indiana Democratic Discourse. The path back to intellectual health requires both individual commitment to analytical rigor and institutional reforms that create incentives for honest thinking rather than ideological performance. This isn't just an academic problem that affects only scholars and journalists, it's a democratic imperative that affects every citizen's ability to make informed decisions about public affairs. The quality of democratic governance depends directly on the quality of public discourse, which in turn depends on the intellectual integrity of those who shape public opinion. Individual intellectuals must recommit to the fundamental principles of honest inquiry that I outlined in my introduction to the philosophy of history, following evidence wherever it leads, acknowledging uncertainty when knowledge is incomplete, and maintaining willingness to revise conclusions when new facts emerge. This requires psychological courage to resist the social pressures that reward conformity and punish independence, as well as intellectual discipline to maintain analytical rigor even when it produces uncomfortable conclusions. The practice begins with small acts of intellectual honesty that build habits of independent thinking. This means acknowledging when your preferred political party makes mistakes, recognizing valid points in arguments you generally oppose, and refusing to dismiss evidence simply because it contradicts your preconceptions. It means maintaining skepticism toward information that confirms your biases while demanding high standards of evidence for claims that challenge them. These habits of mind, cultivated consistently over time, build the intellectual muscle memory necessary for maintaining analytical independence under pressure. Educational institutions must also reform their practices to reward genuine scholarship over ideological advocacy. This means evaluating research based on methodological rigor rather than political implications, encouraging intellectual diversity among faculty and students, and teaching students to think critically about all ideas rather than defend predetermined conclusions. Universities should function as laboratories for testing ideas, not seminaries for propagating orthodoxies. The reform process requires recognizing that intellectual diversity isn't just politically desirable, it's epistemologically necessary for producing reliable knowledge. Homogeneous intellectual environments systematically distort understanding by eliminating the critical scrutiny that ideas need to be tested and refined. When everyone shares the same assumptions and values, errors go uncorrected and biases remain unexamined. Media organizations bear special responsibility for modeling intellectual honesty in public discourse. Instead of reinforcing partisan narratives that divide audiences into competing camps, journalists should demonstrate how empirical analysis can illuminate complex issues without reducing them to simplistic talking points. This requires professional courage to pursue stories that challenge conventional wisdom and editorial wisdom to prioritize accuracy over ideological convenience or commercial appeal. Citizens themselves must demand better from their intellectual institutions and refuse to support organizations that abandon their commitment to truth-seeking in favor of political advocacy. When universities, media organizations, and think tanks demonstrate systematic bias in their analysis, the public should withdraw support and seek alternative sources of reliable information. Market pressure can drive institutional reform when political pressure fails, but only if citizens maintain high standards for intellectual integrity. The goal isn't perfect objectivity. That's impossible for finite human beings embedded in particular cultural contexts and historical circumstances. The goal is intellectual honesty, the consistent commitment to evaluating ideas based on evidence rather than political utility, acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge while continuing to seek better understanding of complex realities, and maintaining humility about our conclusions while refusing to abandon the pursuit of truth. Conclusion. The ideological trap that captured so many brilliant minds in my era remains active today, seducing American intellectuals with the same false promises of certainty and moral clarity that proved so devastating to democratic discourse in 20th century Europe. But the trap isn't inevitable. It can be resisted through disciplined commitment to empirical analysis and the intellectual courage to prioritize truth over convenience. Democracy's survival depends not on the brilliance of its intellectuals but on their integrity, their willingness to remain faithful to the evidence even when it challenges their deepest convictions. The choice between ideological conformity and analytical independence defines not just individual careers but the quality of democratic discourse itself. In an age of polarization and propaganda, Intellectual honesty becomes a form of civic duty. Choose wisely, democracy depends on it, and future generations will judge us by the intellectual legacy we leave them.